April 3, 1941. Greenwood County, Kansas. The dawn came pale and wet across the wheat fields. Mist clung to the furrows, silvering every stalk of winter rye. A single figure moved through the haze, boots heavy with mud, an old felt hat pulled low, a tin bucket swinging in one hand. His name was Earl Haskins, 43 years old, third-generation farmer, and, as most folks in town liked to joke, a man who could outstubborn a mule. This morning, Earl was in a foul mood. His fields had refused to green up, and the latest fertilizer shipment from Wichita had been delayed for weeks. He'd been tinkering with a homebrew mixture, ammonium nitrate, some barnyard lime, a pinch of diesel, and what he called a dash of luck. His wife called it Earl's stupid mix. He muttered as he worked, scattering handfuls of the powdery compound along a stubborn patch of soil near the tool shed. When he dumped the last bucket, the mixture hissed faintly as it hit the damp earth, a strange, fizzing sound that made him frown. The chickens scattered. Later that afternoon, the sound returned, louder this time. Earl had gone back with his tractor, the old Fordson coughing as he tilled the field. The blade hit a rock, or what he thought was a rock, and in an instant, a sharp crack echoed through the valley. The ground jumped. The tractor lurched forward, tires blown, dirt raining down around him. Earl stumbled out, ears ringing, face streaked with dust. A small crater smoked in the soil behind him. He stared at it for a long time. Then he laughed, a single, incredulous bark that rolled into silence. The next morning, word had spread. By noon, a pair of men in dark suits and polished shoes were standing at his gate. They weren't from the county. They weren't from the state. Their car bore government plates, and their expressions were as unreadable as stone. "Mr. Haskins?" one of them asked. "We'd like to talk about your fertilizer." Earl blinked. "My what?" Within days, his quiet Kansas farm would become the center of an investigation that reached from Washington, D.C. to the laboratories of the Allied Munitions Board. And Earl, the man everyone said was too stubborn for his own good, was about to hand the Allies one of the most unlikely breakthroughs of the war. The two men introduced themselves only as Mr. Danner and Mr. Cole. They carried briefcases, spoke in clipped tones, and never once smiled. Earl led them into his kitchen, where the air smelled of coffee and old wood smoke. His wife, Margie, stood by the stove, arms crossed, her expression tight with suspicion. Danner opened his case, withdrew a folded stack of papers, and set them on the table. "Mr. Haskins," he began, "what you've made on your property contains compounds currently under strict wartime regulation. We need to know how you mixed it, and where you got the ingredients." Earl looked between them, confused and defensive. "It's just fertilizer. Stuff from the co-op, some diesel from the shed, and..." Cole cut him off. "Diesel? You mixed fuel with ammonium nitrate?" Earl shrugged. "Didn't mean nothin' by it. Soil was too damn dry. Thought maybe it'd help stick to the dirt." The two men exchanged a look, one of those silent communications bureaucrats perfected over years of classified briefings. Cole leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Mr. Haskins, do you have any idea what happens when ammonium nitrate meets hydrocarbon fuel?" Earl scratched the back of his neck. "Well, I do now." Margie slammed her dish towel down. "You're not talking him away for tryin' to fix his crops." Danner raised a calming hand. "No, ma'am. We're not here to arrest anyone. We're here to understand something. What your husband did, unintentionally, might be significant to the war effort. They asked for samples. They asked for soil. They even scraped bits of twisted metal from Earl's ruined tractor into glass jars. When they left, their car raised a plume of dust down the gravel road, vanishing toward Wichita. That night, Earl sat on the porch, watching the sunset fade behind the silos. He'd been told someone from the War Department would contact him soon. Maybe it was a joke, he thought. Maybe they'd just laugh about the crazy farmer who blew up his own field. But 2 days later, a military truck rolled up the lane, followed by a second car bearing Army Chemical Corps insignia. This time, they brought men in uniform, scientists, engineers, and one soft-spoken British liaison with a clipped accent who introduced himself as Captain Robert Mallory. Mallory shook Earl's hand firmly. "Mr. Haskins, I've read your statement. Fascinating work, quite unconventional." "Unconventional," Earl muttered. "That's a fancy way of saying stupid." Mallory smiled faintly. "Sometimes, Mr. Haskins, stupidity and genius are separated by an explosion." They set up a makeshift lab in Earl's barn. Tables, instruments, glass beakers, even a small metal press. Earl wasn't allowed within 20 feet of it without permission. Men in gloves and masks tested samples, took notes, and spoke in hushed tones about stability, yield, and temperature thresholds. By the end of the week, they confirmed what the explosion had hinted: Earl's crude fertilizer mixture could be stabilized into a powerful, yet controllable, ammonium nitrate fuel explosive, a compound the Allies were desperate to perfect. In Britain, shortages of TNT and nitroglycerin were stalling production. In North Africa, engineers struggled to find materials that could be shipped safely under desert heat. The Haskins mixture, cheap and easy to make, could change everything. Late one evening, as the men packed their samples, Mallory turned to Earl. "You may have just solved one of the war's quietest crises," he said. "But I'm afraid you can't tell anyone, not your neighbors, not your family, not even your church pastor. As of tomorrow, this property is under government confidentiality." Earl stared at him, stunned. "So that's it? You take my mix and disappear?" Mallory hesitated, then nodded. "That's war, Mr. Haskins. The right idea at the wrong time can win or lose nations." As the convoy drove away, Earl stood in the empty yard, the faint smell of fuel and nitrate still clinging to the night air. He had no way of knowing that his stupid mix was already on its way to the laboratories of Aberdeen Proving Ground, where it would be tested, refined, and eventually weaponized, under the strictest secrecy. April 10, 1941. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. A gray, wind-bitten morning that smelled of concrete and gun oil. The convoy that carried Earl Haskins's samples rolled into Aberdeen under a blanket of official indifference, the sort that comes when classified material is routine freight. Guards at the gate checked paperwork stamped with heavy ink and barcoded with compartmentalized codes. Men in leather coats and garrison caps went about their tasks with the robotic efficiency of men who had watched science be conscripted into warfare for longer than most of them had been alive. Inside Building 310, behind a steel door that required 3 keys and a supervisor's retinal check to open, a dozen technicians hovered over a stainless steel workbench. The room was a cathedral of instrumentation, muffled balances, pressure gauges, blast shields, and an array of metal canisters that looked more like art than implements of war. The man in charge of the day's experiments was Colonel Samuel Pierce, 60, a career Army engineer with steel-gray hair and a jaw perpetually clenched against bad news. "You're sure the chain of custody is intact?" Pierce asked, not really addressing anyone in particular. His voice had the clipped firmness of command. Behind him stood Dr. Evelyn Shaw, late 30s, a chemist from the National Defense Research Committee whose resume read like a who's who of wartime science: radiochemistry, explosives testing, industrial chemistry. She moved with a deliberate calm, the sort that comes from having spent long hours at the bench and longer hours arguing with finance committees about the cost of safety. Captain Robert Mallory, introduced earlier at Earl's farm, stood by a table of labeled vials. He still wore the crease of an Englishman's reserve. "Everything the farmer sent has been catalogued," he said. "No identifying marks. Samples A through J." Pierce nodded. "Good. We'll treat them like any other suspect charge, no hypotheses, only data." His eyes flicked to Dr. Shaw. "Proceed." They did not proceed with the kind of reckless curiosity Earl had displayed with his Fordson tractor. Aberdeen's tests were designed to answer a set of strictly non-actionable questions: stability under controlled stress, reaction to shock in a laboratory environment, comparative brisance against known standards, all phrased in bureaucratic euphemisms that disguised how high the stakes really were. At no point did anyone sketch a recipe, mix proportions, or a method that could be replicated in a barn. The men and women in that room measured only performance characteristics, recorded ambient conditions, and checked for volatility. When the first round of tests concluded, Dr. Shaw removed her gloves and exhaled like someone who'd been holding her breath for a long time. "It behaves," she said simply. "It's less sensitive than some of our current emergency substitutes, and it scales in a way that suggests industrial manufacture would be feasible, under strict controls." Pierce's forehead creased. Less sensitive was an understatement that made policy men smile and field commanders breathe easier. From a distance, it meant ordnance that could be transported more safely. Up close, it meant fewer accidental detonations in crowded ports or primitive supply convoys. Mallory allowed himself a small, almost private, smile. "So your farmer didn't merely blow up his tractor, Colonel. He may have given us a path around a bottleneck." News travels differently in wartime. It does not travel by newspapers or radio bulletins. It is carried in secure envelopes, in the hush of a teleprinter, in the low-light corridors of the War Production Board. Within days of the Aberdeen report, a cluster of agencies converged: the Army Chemical Corps, the Ordnance Department, representatives from the British Ministry of Supply, and a shadow detachment from the Office of Strategic Services. They all used different acronyms and different fonts on their stationery, but they agreed on two things: secrecy and speed. What followed was a study in coordinated compartmentalization. The farmer's name became an administrative cipher. Earl Haskins was no longer a man. He was Subject K-47 in some files, Origin Point in others. Only a handful of officials knew his identity, fewer still knew where he lived. Orders went out to rural postmasters and local sheriffs: do not disclose, do not discuss. For Earl and Margie, the government's silence felt like a living thing, a cold hand on the shoulder that never left. Meanwhile, in the industrial heartlands, the question was not whether the mixture could be used but how to turn a handful of barn-mixed samples into metric tons of predictable, safe material. Engineers from the Tennessee Eastman Company and DuPont were drafted into emergency advisory boards. Factory managers convened late-night conferences about raw materials, supply chains and, crucially, how to maintain microscopic tolerances in processes that would feed munitions filling lines. Classic wartime pragmatism met with a modern industrial mindset. The War Production Board issued memos that spoke of feedstock sourcing and process homogenization, phrases designed to be dry and non-salacious. In practice, the work required improvisation on a national scale, rerouting shipments of fertilizer-grade ammonium nitrate away from civilian farms, persuading fuel suppliers to provide hydrocarbon blends earmarked for military use only, and building new handling protocols for railcars and storage depots to prevent catastrophic accidents. The ethical dimension crept into conversations in places where men and women had time to think about more than production quotas: an observatory office in Washington, a quiet break room at an ordnance plant, a small Methodist church in Greenwood County where an earnest pastor kept wondering whether informing the community would have been the right thing. Dr. Shaw found herself at the center of that moral calculus more often than she'd intended. Men in suits asked whether scaling such a mixture might endanger civilians. Military logisticians asked whether a cheap, easily sourced explosive would reduce casualties by allowing engineers to clear obstacles faster. The answers were complicated, and no one pretended otherwise. Back in Greenwood County, secrecy began to strain the fabric of daily life. Earl received a single envelope, a crisp check with a stamped number and a form that required his signature. There was a non-disclosure attached, written in legal language and signed by a man with the imprimatur of the Department of War. Margie stared at the check as if it were a live coal. The neighbors noticed the men in dark suits again. They whispered in grocery aisles and at church socials. Earl's friends prodded like cattle. He told them he'd sold a patent on improved fertilizer, a lie that felt like a small crime. At Aberdeen, the sample set expanded. What had started as a crude, accidental mixture was now being examined for variance. What happened if the feedstock came from different suppliers, how humidity affected shelf life, whether packaging could reduce shock sensitivity. Each test result generated another set of orders, and each order multiplied the secrecy envelope. Mundane things took on enormous consequence: the texture of a burlap sack, the seam strength of railway containers, the timing of convoys through dockyards. Production planners learned that wartime logistics are not glamorous, they are arithmetic and patience, cunning and the ability to persuade. They had to convince factory owners to retool, union leaders to accept changes in shift patterns, and transport managers to prioritize shipments that might once have been considered low priority. In factory canteens, at the end of long shifts, women working the filling lines called them the gray rounds, bland, efficient, and essential. And yet, for all the bureaucratic machinery and industrial might thrown at the problem, there remained a human heart to it. Dr. Shaw, who had lost a brother in France the previous year, would later write in a private letter that she kept a small photograph of Earl Haskins pinned inside her lab coat, not because she thought of him as a hero, but because she needed a reminder of how accidental elegance can sometimes appear in the most ordinary places. The photograph was of a mud-streaked man with a stubborn jaw and a grin that suggested he did not entirely trust engineers in ties. Security tightened. Men who handled the mixture swore oaths in solemn rooms. Rail cars carrying raw materials bore misleading placards designed to confuse enemy intelligence. The British liaison, Mallory, arranged for some shipments to be masked as agricultural equipment bound for neutral ports, others were routed through Canada and then south to avoid predictable U-boat patrol lines. Every innovation produced a counter-innovation of secrecy and logistics. As the prototypes passed more tests, voices in high places argued for one crucial step: mass production. It was the point at which the civilian agricultural economy would be asked to surrender portions of its supply chain. Farmers would be encouraged, some might say coerced, to sell their fertilizer-grade stockpiles to the government. Contracts were written, rubrics applied, and a vast procurement operation began to hum. Earl watched these moves from a distance. He had been offered a position, an honorary consult, a nominal title, but he refused. He wanted neither fame nor the guilt that comes with the knowledge that something you inadvertently created could be used for killing. Yet he also understood the logic. When he saw a photograph of a convoy of engineers clearing a road in North Africa, their caption noting that new improvised charges had helped speed repairs after an Axis raid, he felt a complicated prickle of pride and nausea. Some nights, Margie would find him standing at the fence, hands in his pockets, the War Department's silence a drumbeat in the dark. The country was at war, and the Haskins farm had become a small but notable note in the larger score. For Earl, the event that began as a practical fix for stubborn soil had become a moral crucible, and nothing about it was simple. June 1942. Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, the air hung heavy with the smell of solvents and metal dust. Inside a sprawling brick complex, 2,000 men and women worked under sodium lamps that never went dark. The rhythmic thump of presses, the hiss of pneumatic mixers, and the low hum of conveyors formed a soundscape that felt both mechanical and alive, a heartbeat for the war effort. To the untrained eye, it was just another ordnance factory. To those inside, it was something else entirely, the birthplace of the Allies' newest industrial secret. Dr. Evelyn Shaw stood at the observation catwalk, clipboard in hand, watching the filling crews at work below. The mixture, codenamed Compound H-47, after the original test sample from Earl Haskins's farm, had passed every evaluation. Now it was being produced on a scale once reserved for TNT. The difference was subtle but revolutionary. H-47 required no exotic chemicals, no sensitive nitration baths, and no specialized cooling systems. It could be produced cheaply, safely, and quickly, and transported with minimal risk of detonation. Production efficiency up 30% since last quarter, an assistant shouted over the machinery. Losses at less than 1%. Dr. Shaw nodded. She didn't smile. Success in her line of work was a double-edged thing. Each new efficiency meant more explosives at the front, more craters, more shattered bridges, more burned-out tanks. But it also meant fewer supply shortages, fewer Allied soldiers waiting helplessly without ordnance. In a far corner of the plant, inspectors tested batches with calibrated charges. A loud thud echoed through the chamber as another test charge went off, muffled by reinforced concrete walls. On the viewing monitor, the blast signature flared bright and clean. The engineers around her murmured in quiet satisfaction. Mallory approached from behind, his uniform creased and dusty from travel. "It works better than anyone hoped," he said. "And the ministry back home wants to replicate it in Sheffield by autumn." Dr. Shaw looked down at the workers, mostly women in overalls and bandanas, their faces pale in the factory glow. "We'll need better ventilation," she said absently. "They shouldn't have to breathe this stuff for 10 hours a day." Mallory followed her gaze. "No one's meant to breathe war, Doctor. But you and I both know we've been doing it for years." Across the Atlantic, British plants under blackout conditions began their own production. In Birmingham, Liverpool, and Cardiff, improvised filling shops adapted to the H-47 formula. Crates labeled agricultural supplies left American ports and arrived under escort, their manifests falsified. In Scotland, Royal Engineers quietly tested the compound for demolition work, finding it ideal for clearing roads, railway bridges, and bunkers. It spread, quietly and invisibly, through the arteries of war. H-47 filled depth charges, shaped charges, and even mining ordnance in the Italian campaign. It wasn't as powerful as TNT, but it was abundant, stable, and reliable. For Allied logistics officers, that made it invaluable. Colonel Pierce, reading reports in his Aberdeen office, understood what few others could say aloud: the farmer's fertilizer had given the Allies something almost as important as the atomic bomb: consistency. The ability to keep the front lines supplied, no matter how many factories were bombed or ports blockaded. And yet, for all the industrial triumph, the story was locked behind walls of secrecy. Official documents listed it simply as synthetic compound number 47. Not one line mentioned the Kansas farmer who'd stumbled onto it by accident. Back in Greenwood County, Earl Haskins lived as if nothing had changed. The war rolled on across newspapers and radio broadcasts, but his name was never spoken. His fields grew thick with rye again, though he used only store-bought fertilizer now. Some nights, Margie found him sitting on the porch, staring toward the barn where the stupid mix had once hissed and smoked. He'd gotten 2 more envelopes since that first check, both from Washington, both unsigned. One contained a medal without inscription. The other, a typed note. "Your contribution has been instrumental in ensuring continued Allied operations. Details of your work will remain classified under War Measures Act 233 until further notice." Earl folded it carefully, slid it into the back of his Bible, and said nothing. By 1944, the Allies had retaken Italy, crossed into France, and were pushing toward Germany. The logistics miracle behind those advances, the steady supply of safe, stable explosives, was a triumph of unseen science and uncredited innovation. In the Ruhr Valley, Royal Engineers detonated hundreds of shaped charges made with compound H-47 to collapse tunnels and halt enemy counteroffensives. In the Pacific, Seabees used it to carve airstrips out of volcanic rock. Every time it worked, predictably, efficiently, a piece of Earl's accident echoed in the sound of the blast. But war has a short memory. When victory finally came, H-47 vanished into classified archives, replaced by newer compounds and newer names. Its formula, simple and elegant, was quietly adapted into civilian industry, used in mining, quarrying, and construction. To the world, it became just another industrial explosive. To the few who knew, it was something else, a reminder that history often turns on the smallest, strangest moments, a farmer's stubbornness, a flash of fire in a Kansas field, and a mixture everyone had once called stupid. September 1947. Washington, D.C. The war was over. The medals had been pinned, the parades marched, and the speeches given. The machinery of secrecy, however, did not stop when the guns did. Inside a dim archive room at the Office of Scientific Research and Development, a clerk stamped Declassification Review, 1977, on a folder marked H-47 material records. Inside were reports from Aberdeen, memoranda from the British Ministry of Supply, and a yellowing photograph of a Kansas wheat field with a smoking crater in its center. The folder was placed into a filing cabinet, third drawer from the bottom, and forgotten. But the formula didn't vanish. In the years after the war, industrial chemists began adapting wartime processes for peacetime industries, mining, construction, road building. They found that H-47, with its mix of stability and low cost, was ideal for controlled blasting. It re-emerged quietly under a new name, ANFO, short for ammonium nitrate fuel oil. No one outside a few government chemists realized that ANFO's lineage traced back to a farmer's dusty field in Kansas. In mining manuals and engineering journals, it was credited to postwar industrial research. The real story, the accident, the secrecy, the moral weight, never made it to print. Meanwhile, Earl Haskins had aged into a quiet man. His hair silvered early, the hard lines in his hands deepened. He seldom spoke of the war, though he'd followed it in every newspaper. Greenwood County knew him only as a stubborn farmer with odd luck and a scar across his cheek from a tractor accident. One spring afternoon, a black government sedan pulled up the lane again. Earl was fixing a fence when the passenger door opened and out stepped a man he hadn't seen in years. "Captain Mallory," Earl said, wiping his hands. "Didn't expect to see you in peacetime." Mallory smiled, older now, the war etched into the corners of his face. "Nor I, Mr. Haskins. I'm passing through. Thought I owed you a visit." They sat on the porch while Margie brought coffee. The air was warm, the cicadas loud. Earl broke the silence first. "So, what became of it?" "My mix." Mallory looked out across the fields. "It kept a lot of men alive," he said finally. "It helped us build faster than they could destroy. It wasn't glorious, but it mattered." Earl nodded. "And now?" "Now it moves mountains," Mallory said with a faint grin. "Literally. They use it in quarries. It's safe. Cheap. Practical. You'd like that." Earl chuckled softly. "Guess stupidity pays off after all." Mallory's expression softened. "Sometimes the best ideas come from people who don't know they're inventing something. You gave us a tool. What we did with it, that's history's burden, not yours." The sun dipped low, painting the fields gold. When Mallory finally stood to leave, he shook Earl's hand and pressed a small envelope into it. "Something the War Department forgot to send," he said. "You earned it." Inside was a typed citation, unsigned, stamped, confidential, not for public release. It read, "For unintentional yet invaluable contribution to Allied ordnance research and production, resulting in improved operational capacity across multiple theaters. The United States government acknowledges the importance of your work under project designation H-47. Earl never showed it to anyone. He folded it into his Bible beside the first letter and left it there until the day he died. Decades later, when the declassification finally came, a handful of historians pieced together the fragments. A Kansas farmer. An accident. A fertilizer mix that changed the logistics of an entire war. Most readers skimmed past the entry, one paragraph buried deep in a 600-page technical report. But among military historians and engineers, the revelation spread quietly. the origins of one of the world's most common industrial explosives lay not in a government lab, but in a muddy Kansas field during a time of desperation. For Dr. Evelyn Shaw, long retired, it was bittersweet. She received a copy of the declassified report in the mail, anonymous, unmarked. Inside was a photograph of Earl standing in front of his barn, hat pulled low, smiling awkwardly at the camera. She placed it on her desk beside her brother's war medal and whispered, "You did your part, Earl." Today, every blast in a quarry, every controlled demolition, every stretch of new highway built with ANFO owes a silent debt to that long-ago morning in 1941. Few remember his name, but the legacy remains, a reminder that innovation does not always begin in laboratories or universities. Sometimes, it begins in frustration, in necessity, and in the stubborn hands of a man just trying to make the soil yield. And though history never wrote his name in bold print, the echoes of his stupid mix still roll across the earth, each blast a quiet salute to the farmer who, without meaning to, helped win a war.